Good afternoon, everyone who's joined us for the Sundown Sessions webinar brought to you by the FRDC and QSMA. I'm Ben Hale from the QSMA, here to welcome you all to this, the fourth of our Sundown Sessions, with some fantastic information that's going to be shared with us from Ben van Delden and Dan Ginger from KPMG. A couple of pieces of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, but you as attendees won't be shown on the video. If you have any questions throughout the session, please use the chat option. You'll see a little speech bubble that says chat on your Zoom window. Feel free to type in any questions throughout the session that you may have for our presenters. Now, I know it's been a pretty big weekend, and a lot of you might have been thinking when you saw Gary Ablett stretched off on Saturday or Penrith's almost come back on Sunday, you were most likely thinking, how do I make my seafood supply chain more resilient? Well, that's going to be answered today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our host for this webinar, Dr. Patrick Hone from the FRDC, and welcome you to this, the fourth of the Sundown Sessions from the QSMA.
Thanks, Ben, and welcome everyone to, yes, a post-football final Monday. And Ben, I did enjoy myself, I will say, and am drinking a lot of water as a result today. I'd like to introduce two great speakers today to talk about a very important subject, a subject that couldn't be more important right now for us in the seafood community, but more importantly for us who also work in the food sector, and seafood is just part of the food sector, and understanding that future in these tumultuous times is really, really important. So I'd like to first of all introduce Daniel Ginger from KPMG. Daniel's a manager in the agri-food sector at KPMG, and will be presenting the report data today from the Food Agility Mission for Life Agri-Food Supply Chain Resilience Report, particularly looking at the digital and data component. And then we're going to hand over to Ben van Delden. And Ben, I've known Ben for some time, and Ben is a man of many, very passions. But today he's here because he's the head of Ag Tech and Circular Economy at KPMG. And you couldn't think of a better combination of things to be in charge of. I have to say it's a dream job, Ben. And I'm looking forward to having your insights into where we're going to talk today with our audience. And it's great to see the audience coming on board for this lunchtime session. Ben, I'm going to hand it over to you, and then you're going to go through to Dan, and then we're going to have a good wrap up at the end. So for those who've got questions, start hitting that chat function. I see there's already 3 chats in there, but if you've got questions, please put them in there. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Patrick, and good afternoon, everyone. It's fantastic to be with you. I always love a conversation with the seafood industry because I'm the son of a family from aquaculture background, oyster farmers, and my father was a fisherman prior to that too, back in New Zealand. So there you go, Patrick. There's another link to this great industry. So the session today that Dan and I will take you through is to share the lessons and insights from a piece of work that KPMG and Food Agility collaborated on in July this year, which was looking at the response to the stresses and shocks affecting Australia's agri-food supply chain or supply chains, and how do we build resilience into the supply chains. So Dan, perhaps if you could take us forward into the pack. Terrific. So one more, please, mate. So importantly, this piece of work really looked at the confluence of shocks and stresses, and really the resulting immense strain that these have placed on Australia's agri-food supply chains. We looked particularly at 6 sectors, of which seafood is one of those 6. We selected these based on the value contribution that the sectors make to the Australian economy. And as we talk through this discussion today, I think it's really important just to, from definitionally, just to touch on what we mean by stresses. So these are long-term trends and pressures that undermine the stability and increase vulnerability of a sector. So these are the things that compound over time. They're a little bit like a niggle when you've sprained your ankle, or like most of these footy players will be feeling today. They build up over time, and then at a certain point you realize you're carrying all this stress, and then when a shock comes along, it has an amplified impact on your industry. So a shock, of course, is a sudden and unpredictable occurrence, and these can be transitory, like an algae bloom, for example. It could be intensive, like a peak storm event, or it could be extensive, so working across a wide area. So we looked at these stresses and shocks affecting the seafood industry, and Dan's going to take us through the specificity of those lessons. What we really observed when we did this work was the current situation with COVID, the bushfires, drought, has really led to a confluence of pressures. And when we were speaking with industry participants, it was pretty apparent that those that had invested in digital and data insights into their supply chains were better able to operate through these challenging times. And so that's the purpose of this report, is to look at the opportunities and strategies for industry to rebuild and strengthen, reinvent, and obviously build resilience through digital tools and platforms. We identify a number of critical supply chain intervention points and a number of core weaknesses in existing supply chains, and offer up mitigation strategies. So the 5 key shocks that we looked at are one, health. So this is looking at the health of the planet, the health of livestock, and the health of humans. So it ties together the correlation of what's impacting the products we eat and how they flow through to impact our own health as well. So that's where biosecurity, for example, sits. The other shocks that we looked at were drought, natural disaster, geopolitical tensions, which of course are ever increasing challenges for Australian exporters, and technology. And that includes cyber and other risks, as well as the rapid pace of change. Dan, if you could move us forward a slide, please. So what do we find at a high level? We came up with 12 key strategies, cross-sectoral strategies for improving the resilience of the agri-food supply chain. And before I get into those, we found that these particularly have the biggest impact on building resilience, but also driving greater cross-sectoral collaboration and investment. And this is super important because what we find is, particularly as you move up through the supply chain closer to the retailer, they don't want a meat system and a fish system and a fruit system. Ultimately, what we want is data standards and food safety standards that can be translated through common digital systems. And that flows beyond food safety, but back into supply chain logistics as well. So we'll unpack a little bit more of that in the talk today as well. So probably the key thing to be mindful of as industry participants is the old saying, don't waste a good crisis. The pandemic has really shaken every industry actor, and now is the time to think about your strategy to invest wisely, to get better foresight and better adaptability as these challenges come in waves across our businesses in the future. So I won't go through all 12 of the cross-sectoral investment opportunities there, but I will call out particularly number 6, implementing digital platforms and solutions, and number 7, embedding interoperable data systems. These two brought together can be game changers for the Australian seafood industry. But I think, Patrick, what's really important is that the seafood industry doesn't need to do these things alone. and it's the opportunity to collaborate with other ag and primary industry sectors that is really important here. Spread the investment cost, spread the knowledge and the learnings, and build infrastructure that supports multiple industries. Maybe we can unpack that in the Q&A. So now I think, Dan, it'd be great to take the group through some of the specific insights from the seafood analysis that you led for this project.
Yep. Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Patrick, as well. So yeah, great to be speaking to you all today, and thanks for joining. My name's Dan, and I'm part of KPMG's Agri-Food team. So I was part of the team working on this report, and as Ben mentioned, I led the seafood component, and I've been involved in a number of projects relating to the fisheries sector, including with the FRDC as well. So I just want to take you through the specific matrix that we formed for seafood industry resilience, and as Ben described, the differences between the stresses being the day-to-day challenges that are faced in the sector, and the shocks that exacerbate or increase the impact of those on the supply chain. So just explaining this matrix quickly, as I know it's can be a bit of a tricky one to on first glance. So on the left-hand side there are the stresses that we identified, and these came out of a number of consultations with industry stakeholders, and also our additional research. The different shades of purple that you see here, the darker the shade is the greater impact that stress tends to have on that particular node of the supply chain or value chain. So you can see there a lot of it's clustered around the production stage, but also some really targeted impacts of those shocks come out when we start to think about processing, when we start to think about transport, and also at the government and regulatory end. And what we've done there is then actually mapped on where do those shocks, those real sudden events that have a massive impact on resilience, and are so relevant this year with everything that's gone on, right from bushfires through to COVID-19. How do these actually exacerbate the day-to-day stresses? What impacts do they have? So just want to firstly take you through a few of the key ones that we drew out in this piece of research. I think it comes as no surprise that that weather and climate change is a massive influence upon the seafood sector, and just the ability to be able to reach fisheries, particularly when we think of open ocean and deep sea fisheries, and being able to reach those fishing grounds. When we start to think about shock weather systems, that's further exacerbated, and I think there's some really key mitigation strategies that can be put into place that we'll delve into shortly. I think a really interesting one, and again, this is something that we see across agriculture, not just in fisheries specifically, but does come out in the fisheries sector, is around freight and the cold chain. And I think firstly addressing the second component of that, the freight space, it's really important obviously to be able to get product to consumers, but do it in a way that is reliable, that is consistent, and that allows Australian seafood, particularly when we think about export markets, to develop an understanding in those markets and a reputation as a consistent quality product. And I think actually accessing freight space is a challenge that is faced across the sector, and being able to be booked on certain flights that take the most direct route, that allow the cold chain to be maintained throughout that process is really important for a lot of seafood industries, and particularly when we start to think about any live export as well, and particularly where they're placed on the plane, how the airlines and the freight forwarders engage. These are all issues in the cold chain and freight availability piece. And stress that when you get a One Health or a geopolitical shock, that exacerbates them hugely, as I think has been seen across agriculture this year in terms of availability, particularly of air freight into export markets that drive returns. So I think that's a really important point. Just moving on to sustainability and social license, and a lot of the stakeholders that we spoke to as part of this piece were really keen to engage with local communities, and we're doing some amazing work in the sustainability space. But I think it's a day-to-day stress, and I think again it's across agriculture, where there's a perception in some local communities that agriculture isn't doing enough in sustainability, which just simply isn't the case in most agricultural businesses. So I think that's a stress that we particularly saw across the production stage of the supply chain. Market access is another really key stress where we saw a number of the shocks have significant impacts, and it's probably the one that was the most wide-ranging across the supply chain. Geopolitical closure of a market or disruption to market access, or a One Health event relating to biosecurity, as we've seen both this year and in niche or specific short-term events in recent years in specific fisheries. This has an impact right across the supply chain. So right through from being able to service your customers at retail, back through actual just sheer physical access of the transport, as we discussed around the freight space and cold chain, and then back into production and where you store that fish and for how long you can do that. So I think that's a particular area where when there's a shock, it has a massive impact upon the whole supply chain. The pests and disease piece, as I've just kind of mentioned, feeds into that in quite a similar way. And I think what we saw is when there is a shock applied in that space, it has the potential to impact the entire industry. And it's interesting, we see similar in sectors such as horticulture, where a disease or pest incursion in one category on one farm, very, very contained outbreak can actually have an impact across the broader industry, because especially when there's not a branded product that the end consumer sees, the entire industry ends up getting impacted, and that can also be the case in terms of market access as well. So this is a space where one small challenge relating to pest and disease in a specific locality can actually have a broader brush impact across the whole sector that can exacerbate that stress. And just lastly, to touch on this point, is around labour supply and succession planning. And this was something that a number of industry stakeholders raised with us around accessing talent, and also planning for the future. So I don't want to spend too long on that point, but I think that was a shock that was that was particularly seen at the production stage, and just ensuring that the right people in the right places are operating. Just moving on now to before we get into the mitigation and some of the digital strategies that we formulated to address those shocks and stresses. Just some of the key themes that were identified across the sector, and some of the really key important points that were raised by stakeholders. Firstly is around, and I won't touch on this too much because it comes out quite prominently in what we'll discuss shortly, but technological advances are enabling different ways of operating that start to take out some of these physical factors, particularly around weather, around labour, and when we start to think about automation and we start to think about onshore operations, any of these activities that allow greater control of supply, greater consistency and quality are going to have benefits for a lot of businesses in terms of returns and how they engage further along the supply chain with retailers, for example, to guarantee supply, to guarantee specific characteristics of the product. The second point here is around market access, and I think across agriculture again, especially since 2015, 2016, with the North Asian free trade agreements with China, Japan, South Korea, that really had a transformative impact upon the export potential of agricultural industries. And what we're seeing now is they've been utilized really successfully as free trade agreements, helping with improving trading conditions from both a tariff and non-tariff barrier perspective. But what we're seeing now is a new range of free trade agreements being signed. So Indonesia is obviously one of the most prominent ones, but also, you know, on the cards with other countries across both the high growth Asian region, but also thinking further afield with the UK, for example. That's going to offer a new series of opportunities for export growth. And what it also does is importantly drive that conversation around diversification of markets and offering producers across the sector with opportunities to shift markets depending upon the conditions that are ongoing in each, and to be able to access different channels when one particular channel may be closed, and that shock that I discussed around market access may be particularly exacerbated for one market or channel over the other. I think two of these points, remaining points here, interlink quite strongly around traceability through the supply chain, and then consumer expectations and purchasing decisions relating to freshness and safety. I think consumers, the consumer agenda and what is important to a consumer is constantly changing. But I think, you know, one of the really key themes in seafood and fisheries is that freshness, it's that quality, and it's that product safety, and it's linking to traceability and knowing who has processed and been a touch point of your fish that's on your plate. But it's also knowing that it's safe. It's knowing that it's of high quality, and I think this is particularly important for Australian seafood, because we do have that reputation, especially in export markets, of high quality, of safety, and maintaining those brand attributes is really critical, especially when competing against lower cost and lower quality products. So being able to trace throughout the supply chain, to really showcase those brand attributes of Australian seafood to an end consumer, showcase that freshness and safety is a really important theme that seafood stakeholders are really strongly pursuing. And I think just lastly here is around that extension of some of the great stories and examples of initiatives that seafood industry players are running, particularly with respect to the sustainability space and issue. And I think one of the things that really stood out to me through engaging a number of industry stakeholders throughout this piece of work was everyone's doing some incredible work relating to making their fisheries more sustainable, engaging with their communities, and really reaching out and extending that great R&D and sustainability progression that is being done. And I think there's a continued need, and this is the same across agriculture again, to continue to help local communities and society more generally to understand the role that fisheries play in their communities, the value that they provide, not just from an economic perspective, but also from a social perspective as well. And a number of the businesses that we spoke to are doing a really great job of doing that. I'll just move on lastly and just spend a couple of minutes talking through some of the mitigation strategies that we identified to potentially play a role in addressing those key shocks and stresses for the seafood sector. And as you'll see, a number of these are cross-sector So across agriculture and the 6 sectors that we looked into. Again, yeah, it's really important to emphasize, as Ben mentioned, that leveraging co-investment and leveraging relationships and partnerships across different industries in Australian agriculture will be really important to drive success and efficiency in a lot of these different strategies. You know, thinking about consolidation of shipments. You know, if a fisheries product is going to the same end market as a horticulture product, can there be a sharing of resources and a sharing of initiatives in this space? I won't touch on the cross-sector opportunities, but I will just quickly dive into the sector-specific options. And I think one really key one here is around supply chain predictive analytics. And again, this could be applied to other sectors, but I think for the fisheries sector, it's really critical because I think the complexity of seafood and the number of different product categories, the number of different variables, the number of different locations across Australia, bringing that together to understand a whole of seafood picture through using the data available to us would be a really powerful tool to be able to offer advanced signals throughout the supply chain. So again, being able to engage retailers to understand what supply do we expect to come through this week or this month, driven by the weather forecasts, would be a really important way to support both the end of the supply chain and the consumer in telling that story, but also with actual business planning for a producer or for a processor, and being able to understand your potential returns. So I think having an analytics tool and an overarching dashboard that allows you to do that allows you to understand the impact of a closure to one of your key logistics channels, and your alternative options for how you can reroute that product using all the data that is available to you in that overarching tool is a really could be a really powerful and like we have it here, transformative source to drive resilience. I think the second one that was really seafood specific and I think a number of stakeholders raised was digital transactions and being able to offer online purchasing as an increasing option across the sector. And really interesting, a couple of years ago I was in one of the wholesale markets in China, particularly looking at the horticulture sector, but there was the meat and the fisheries sections of those massive markets as well, and everything was going digital in terms of transactions. And what that enabled was a really important flow of data that came with the transactions around the supply coming into the market that day, the price based upon that supply, so that the traders and the sellers could actually understand their likely returns, and then understanding the volumes and the channels that gets put out through into the market, and where that product ends up to help to facilitate some of those traceability elements as well. So that's an example of an international group and organization doing that across industries and having a real powerful impact and driven by data. I think the next point to raise, and again, a number of the businesses that we spoke to were doing some really cool work in this space, is around the selective breeding and being able to pinpoint some of the attributes of the fish to be more resilient to the weather, to be more resilient to climate change, to be able to operate across a number of different fisheries, was great from a physical product perspective, but also it has that commercial impact as well of again being able to offer more consistency of supply, being able to offer the same size, the same quality of fish every single time, doing that through selective breeding and enhancing that is able to drive commercial returns from the end customer and retailer. And I think just finally touching there on the digitization of paper records, and that's just more of a general point around being able to plan and to input this data so that it can be used in some of these other tools, be used for these online transactions, for predictive analytics. And when that data is all digitized, it can start to feed into some of these really powerful tools that can really drive enhanced and transformative resilience in the sector. So I'll leave it there for now, but I'll just pass back to Ben, who'll cover some of the recommendations and broader digital drivers that we explored as part of the work.
Thanks, Dan. So I think it's important to just reflect on what do we mean by agri-food resilience? What's the definition that brings together that focus across different industries or sectors within the agri-food domain? So we took an adaptive definition in the report from Stone and Rahim Mahfad, and it's I think really informative. So I'm just going to read this out to you so you understand what we mean by agri-food resilience. So the collective, and that's the key point, ability of agri-food supply chain stakeholders to ensure acceptable, sufficient and stable food supplies at the required times and locations via accurate anticipation of disruptions, and the use of strategies which may delay impact, aid rapid recovery, and allow cumulative learning post-disruption. And when we think about that in the context of COVID more recently, there was a rapid requirement to be able to understand food supply and food security. And that really surfaced one of the big challenges across the ag and food sector was how much of a reliance we had on paper-based reporting systems, and just how accurate and predictive we were able to be around volumes, quantities and quality of produce. Where does it sit? When might it be available for consumption? What's its current location? How do we move it to where the market is for that product? So when we stood back, having looked at these 6 sectors and asked ourselves with our food agility colleagues, what are some of the pan-industry takeaways that would help us at an Australian Inc. level build resilience into our supply chains? And these 4 points really stood out. So that first one being around the importance of being able to collaborate and absorb data and do that quickly. Know where you need to get information from and how to integrate it into your planning and analytic tools, so that we're better able to predict, forecast supply chains and understand what information we're going to need to make these in the moment decisions as shocks present themselves. The second is the critical importance, as we talked about at the top of the call, of data standards and governance frameworks. Really important here that we enable the building of trust across our ag and food supply chains, and recognise that in many cases we have common supply chain partners across these different ag industries, whether it's dairy, livestock, horticulture or aquaculture. When it comes to the transportation, the regulators and the retailers, often we're dealing with the same supply chain partners. So consistency around standards means that people have confidence in systems and can interpret information quickly when they're under pressure and need to do so, which means we need interoperable systems. And that's one of the observed gaps that we have in Australia, and a competitive weakness that we have relative to the markets that we compete against as net agri-food exporters. The third was around the importance of preparing for the risk that adoption of technology presents. So being mindful that the more we depend on technology and data, the more exposed we are to cyber and privacy. So thinking through collectively as an industry, how do we prepare ourselves to protect our important assets, our supply chain infrastructure from the risks of cybersecurity breaches, or importantly, information flowing through those connected supply chains ending up in the wrong hands or used for an unintended purpose. Again, it's about standards, it's about a cohesive response from the Australian research and development community and state and federal government actors. And then lastly, more of a physical infrastructure point, as we've all observed, particularly as we saw so much of the world's air freight decline and a major dependency shift back towards sea freight. We must have the right road and rail infrastructure to connect our ports to our production sites, so we can move product when we need to where the consumer requires it. And this, of course, requires us to think about cross-border transport regulation. And now we're starting to see with a lot of the free trade agreements, again, that linking back into the physical infrastructure being supported with paperless digital transaction tools. And it's a key focus of DORA, of course, in this space as well. So Dan and Patrick, those are the 4 pan-industry key takeaways that we saw as opportunities to build resilience. As we move into the Q&A, Dan, it might be useful to put up slide 8 as well from the pack, which again pulls out 4 big themes. But Patrick, back to you to drive us through some Q&A.
And thanks, Dan and Ben, and very informative. We have got some questions coming through, and I think to give our audience their due, let's start. So we might better get. There's quite a few questions come through, so we might start with the first one. So Ben's fielded a question. So COVID, so this report's been released. Obviously, COVID doesn't mean business as usual. So how did COVID change so when the report got released, have you seen any changes in the way industry has responded in response to the findings? So, I'm not saying that the seafood industry is not the fastest ones to react, but I suppose, is there any lessons we can see from the release of this report?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So Dan, I'll start, and if you need to fill in behind me. What the report has done, it was very timely, Patrick. It came out in July, so COVID was already a thing, round 1 at least. But what it's done is really, I think, brought the conversation to a collective Australian ag and food industry level. So it's really helped socialise the importance of this digital infrastructure at an Oz Inc. level. And so from that, there's been a number of initiatives that have come to light, and certainly pleasing to see the desire to co-invest in developing some of these solutions. At a federal level, of course, the Ag Innovation Agenda really calls out the importance of data hubs, calls out the importance of, alongside NFF, data standards and data interoperability. And of course, Food Agility is very strongly focused on data standards and supporting a consistent understanding of how information should be collated and shared and stored. So I think the other thing that COVID has done and accelerated is the people's appreciation of the need to actually understand how to diversify their export strategies, have optionality, Patrick, around how to get a product to market if your core supply chain infrastructure is impacted, and that that has been really important in the red meat industry, particularly here in Victoria, where the Melbourne lockdowns have created impacts on the processing facilities here. So having those diverse strategies has become really apparent.
And I've just, while you're doing that, Ben, I've just dropped into the chat the ag innovation agenda that was released that you've pointed to as being one of the responses to what we're seeing from reports like this. We've got a comment here from Marshall Betzel. He's rightly said, when you look at that score and those different colours of, I think it was purple, as it went across, Dan, when you're reporting, he was of the opinion that maybe sustainability and social license would have been almost dark purple, almost the way across, but you've only had it in the producer side. Any comments on that from either of you?
Yeah, I think that's that's a fair assessment, and I think, and I might just nip back down to that slide. Yeah, I mean, we see sustainability and social license play out very differently across the supply chain, and I definitely agree with you, Marshall, that sustainability is a key point when we come, especially to retail, and how that's portrayed to the and told as a story to the end consumer. But I think the reason why production had the dark purple was because the sustainability element plays out, but also more of the social license of the physical fishery itself, and in terms of how that engages with the local community. So I think that's why there's the slight differentiation there, but absolutely appreciate and agree with your comment too.
I just might go to one more of Marshall's questions, and it's one of these ones. Our industry loves trust, and it's this issue of who owns the data. So it's not just the control of the data, but everyone's very concerned about the ownership. So you didn't mention much about the ownership of the data. You talked about interoperable, and there's a lot of trust there that your data is not going to get misused. So who's going to field that one?
I might take that one, Patrick, and just to segue back to Dan's great answer on the previous question as well. What we did find around the role of I guess the sustainability and social license drivers, and the role of markets and retail was often those retailers are speaking on behalf of the consumer, so they're actually instigating that pressure back through the supply chain a lot. So that's in part why we said that the stress was bigger on the production end than the retail end, because the retailers tend to be the influencers of it on behalf of their consumers. To the data ownership question, look, who should control the data? Data ownership should sit with the originator, is my view, and it's up to them then to permission the use of it. And therefore, what we critically need for data systems is a method for permissioning the use and access to information. So, to whom can that data be provisioned, and on what for what purposes are the two fundamental things that we need from an Australian agri-food data exchange framework.
Yeah, no, good answer. And Peggy's gone on that same ideas around, well, obviously, if you do in a perfect market, if you could actually have all the information, you would be better informed. But the question is, how do you incentivize people to create the perfect market of data? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think the lessons we've been learning as we've been looking at the role of data in agriculture, both here in Australia and globally, Patrick, over about 5 or 6 years looking at this space, is it's really important that the originator of the data, the contributor of the data, gets an early benefit back from doing so. And often people sort of come to this conversation thinking that might be some form of commercial, financial incentive, but actually in reality, it's most often valuable analytics, and particularly benchmarking data. So the ability to give some of your information and get back some relativity of how your operation is faring against industry standards and averages. So that incentivization through access to benchmarking data is one of the key drivers, I think, to drive participation. The other that we talk about a lot with our regulatory friends is the importance of supporting industries who are contributing data with reduced regulation. So using reg tech, as it's referred to really focus on leaving the good actors alone, evidenced by their data, and putting the effort into where the bad actors in the supply chain are, to make sure that our weakest links are lifted, so that benefits the overall quality and confidence in the supply chain.
No, good answer. And just as an aside, many of our commercial fishers have to provide data to demonstrate that they were catching what they said they did. Some of our fishing agencies have actually incentivized them by making it lower cost if you provide it electronic versus paper. And you can think about it in cost recovery. Of course, it's going to be cheaper for the agency to take electronic data. So there are some good examples of that incentivization, but I think the issue for many of us is if you're going to fish for market, what is the market signal that you're fishing to? And I think that's the data signal that we're looking for. I'd like to just explore a little bit more about the future proofing, because that's what we're all right now. And you talked about some of the opportunities there. You talked about the cybersecurity threat. You talked about some of the other opportunities. But if you were, let's say, it's hard to say, just a default seafood company, I don't want to call it a norm, something. Right now, what would be the 2 or 3 key things you would do if you were that seafood company to future-proof yourself?
Well, that's a great question. I think fundamentally it always starts with being very clear about where the points of trust and the points of pain are in your supply chain. So points of trust, being really, really clear about who is relying on what data points. They could be manually collected at the moment. They might not necessarily be digitally captured, but what are the data points that matter most, that reinforce value, either in the relationships you have with your supply chain partners or the price that you get for your product? If you can start by mapping those and being very comfortable that you understand what information is necessary to reinforce those points of trust, that's the first step. The second is to look at that through a slightly different lens and understand where pain, shocks, stresses can affect your supply chain. So again, in this context, giving yourself a sense of what is the likelihood and impact of those shock stresses or pain points occurring in your business and in your supply chain. When you've understood those 2 things, Patrick, that's when you're best able to make a decision about how do you move forward and digitize your supply chain management, because you only want to invest in the things that are going to accentuate and maintain trust and mitigate those pain points. Most other investment in data and analytics then is interesting, but not necessarily valuable. So I'd always start with those 2.
And just exploring that, Ben and Dan, if you're a small company, how do you find the unknown unknowns here? Because you're only going to work in the points that you've currently got on your system. So how do you find the other opportunities that are not currently available to you because they're not in your supply chain data points?
Yeah, great question. And look, that's where the power of industry bodies and the FRDC is an example, Patrick, of being able to actually help broaden the conversation beyond the lane that you're acting in. So I guess it's discussions like today where we get to go a little bit outside our own business and silo and sort of explore the lessons and learnings from other sectors. And that it's a really good question, and it's so important that we give ourselves time to learn from parallel industries, because invariably, we're not the first ones to build the solution. Most of the impactful innovation is the translation of something that works in another part of a market and applying it to yours. So if you're small, that's really important, because it costs a lot less to use something that's already available and existing than it does to build a bespoke solution for a small to medium enterprise.
Ben, I noticed you've been very quiet there, and I bet you've been champing at the bit to tell us that there are cheap, really affordable online platforms that you can go digital right now. Thoughts after listening to this?
It's data is everything, isn't it? And you can't measure, if you can't measure, well, you can't manage what you can't measure. So I think it's really important to decide what you want to measure. And as I've discovered by setting up stores for Love Australian Prawns and others, that the analytics that are available from those stores are pretty high end. So you don't have to start at the top of the food chain, so to speak. And especially if you're desperate to get online and start selling online, those platforms are designed to make it easy for you as someone who's not technologically adept. So I would always encourage go and have a play with some of these platforms. You can't really break anything, but you may just learn something. So, I guess if you're not a tech person, don't worry, you don't have to be. Sometimes you can use, built-in tools to give you intelligence that you wouldn't have expected could be available to you.
So Ben, when you were looking at this, and Daniel, did you get a feel for the capability, capacity building, and where people felt like they needed their hand held, or was it about tech learning? What sort of upskilling did you see coming out of the report? Because what Ben said, people have the fear of the unknown on going online. It's actually can be relatively painless. But how do you build that capability and confidence to do it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Dan, do you want to reflect first on your discussions with the seafood industry?
Definitely, and I think something that's come through both through this piece of research and more broadly as well is the first step is always understanding which pieces of data are the most critical for a business to record and to analyze, and through that, most often those pieces are going to be the ones that that the business understands and that the business really needs to analyze and use in order to drive improvement. So it's about having a really good structure, I think, and a really good strategy for using data and identifying which pieces are going to be most useful. And I think, the amount of data that's collected, especially in a really complex industry and complex businesses in fisheries, the amount of data that's collected and the breadth of that data, the depth of it, can be intimidating to supply chain stakeholders, and actually having a really good strategy of what are we collecting, why are we collecting it, and what are we using it for, and working through those key questions makes it a bit more manageable and can bring it down to kind of a bite-sized chunk, but also deliver the most impact for the investment.
Yeah, I think in terms of key capabilities, that sort of got to come back to the two fundamentals of if you're going to do anything good with data and analytics, it really comes down to having good data. So knowing, first of all, what to collect and how to collect it are probably two fundamental capabilities that are so critical to have in your business. Because as Dan's alluded to, there is so much data out there. If you don't collect it wisely and manage it carefully, you'll spend all your time trying to tidy it up. So that comes back to your earlier comment, Patrick, about the importance of data standards as well. So being really clear about that and how you're going to govern data in your organization or in your industry is a really valuable investment of time. Then the next thing I would say, as it pertains to the seafood industry, is thinking about the technology tools that can help you collect that data real time, and often in a way that removes the human from the environment, because then you're starting to get data from complex or dangerous situations, which allows you to make decisions without putting your staff at risk. So and I think the seafood industry has got some fantastic innovation and technologies in that regard.
So Peter's asked a question. So where are the other sectors finding those skills capacity? Is it internal training, upskilling, or are they bringing new people in for new partnerships?
Like, this is a real passion point for me, Patrick. We were lucky enough to do a project for the community of RDCs, including fisheries, last year, coordinated by Cotton RDC. It was called Growing a Digital Future. And the work that we were asked to do was to look at the digital capabilities of the Australian agricultural workforce. So the sort of 240,000 people working in the primary industry sector, looking at what the existing training programs were that were available to them that spoke to digital capability. So 1,880 vocational education training programs. 4.7% of those actually have digital capability in the curriculum. So sadly, we're training for yesterday's industry, not tomorrow's. So fundamentally, what we need to do is do a complete refresh of our vocational education training, and to make sure that wherever possible, we've infused digital capability into those courses. Because regardless of what role you're performing in agriculture, there is a high chance that it's going to be impacted by digital disruption. In fact, 1 in 3 jobs in ag going forward are technology primarily in their nature, and 41% of all roles in agriculture in Australia will be impacted by digital over the next 10 years. And that was a stat pre-COVID. I think it's even higher now.
And Ben, I noticed we've got 4 minutes, and Ben Howell's going to suddenly pull the bell on me, but I do want to get one pitch in to the KPMG team, because it's something I'm quite passionate about. Is obviously there's a lot of exciting things happening out there, and making people aware of them is half the conversation at the moment, and also giving them tools to work out which one makes the opportunity for them. Where's the opportunity cost if you don't pick one or the other? I just want to talk a little bit about the AusAg Data Exchange, and I'm very passionate about that one. But Ben, you might explain how you don't necessarily have to pick the AusAg Data Exchange. You just need to know that your sector is a party to it. Because sometimes it's the systems behind, like when you go to the Commonwealth Bank, you don't need to know all the bank share data and have a security system so that you can, you just know that there are systems in there. Maybe just talk a little bit about the AusAg Data Exchange and what we're looking to achieve across the sectors.
Yeah, happy to do that. Thanks, Patrick. So this goes back to my earlier comment about making sure that Australia is able to compete globally, and this is an area where we're behind the 8 ball. So the AusAg Data Exchange seeks to create a frictionless data highway. So if you are an originator of data and you want to share it with another supply chain partner, the AusAg Data Exchange seeks to make that simple and efficient for you. And at its core, really unlock more management capacity so you can focus on doing what you do and not getting too caught up in cleaning and moving data for the purposes of sharing. And the project is driven as a co-investment project with the primary industry producers as the intended owners of that data service solution. So for want of a better description, it's essentially a service owned by and built for the primary producers of Australia, but enabling them to participate with the wider ecosystem of the capital markets, of the logistics providers, the retailers, the regulators, etc. So it is a whole of industry project that Fisheries RDC are playing a really key role in. And we look forward to announcing a number of other RDCs, universities, state and federal departments, and industry participants that are on board with that project.
Ben Howe, I think we need to wrap up, but if anybody does want to know anything about the AusAg Data Exchange, please chase myself up, or I'm sure the KPMG team would also like to talk, but there's many other sectors who are very excited about that particular opportunity. Just quickly, Dan's done the really clever trick of putting up the details of both Ben and Dan up on the slide as we can see it. Ben Hale will be putting out if you really want to watch this whole Zoom or share it with friends, etc. There's a whole resource on the Queensland Seafood Marketers Association website. It's a fantastic resource. There's always lots of good information up there. I'd like to thank our partners at QSMA once again, and Ben for putting on a great event. It's great to see Marshall there today, and I think I saw Mr. Fogarty, James there. We can have a few less football nights until the All Blacks get beaten this weekend. And finally, to the KPMG team, thank you very much for your insights and also providing your details. Can I say, one of the things that I'm finding out about COVID is that we're changing our whole way to want to work to each other. And, you know, I've been very excited about the way we're working with groups like KPMG to all find a common way forward. And it's been really quite illuminating the last 8 months as we all realize that we're all in the same boat. We might have different journeys, but we certainly need to all work out how to make that boat work. So thank you very much, team. Have a good rest of the day for Monday and look forward to seeing you all soon in another Sundowner series. And Ben, very early to start drinking.
It is very early, so we'll probably hold off until the regular time of 4 p.m. For the Sundowner sessions. And I just want to bring in a plug for the next one. We're having a break next week, but the next one, it looks like we've got Veronica Papacosta from SIA. He's going to give us a peek under the hood of what I would call the biggest seafood campaign to hit the airwaves in history. Thanks very much to the federal government for getting on board with that and providing the funds. Veronica's going to, the campaign would have been less than 24 hours old. I think it's launching on the 7th or the 8th of November on the Sunday. So if you're interested in what will inevitably be a great tailwind for all seafood marketing over the next 12 months, I really strongly suggest you sign up for the session where Veronica will show us exactly how the SIA campaign will come together and roll out over the next 12 months. There'll be unmissable viewing. Monday, November the 9th, but we'll be sending out stuff through the socials and email. And once again, just thank you all the attendees for your great questions, and especially Patrick, Dan and Ben for your insights today. We'll catch
Ben, was that under the hood because you just loved Bathurst this year?
I don't think we can get more sporting analogies into one session, can we, Patrick?
No, we can't.
With that, we'll call the whistle on this one, and we'll see you all on the 9th of November. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, team. Bye.